An ordinary lunch rush takes a shocking turn when Martha, a struggling elderly waitress, accidentally spills hot coffee on Barron Trump. The entire diner freezes, expecting outrage, but what happens next stuns everyone. A moment of tension turns into an unexpected twist that changes Martha's life forever. What did Barron do? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Martha adjusted the fraying strap of her stained apron, wincing as the knot tightened against her aching back. Another grueling shift at Fred's diner awaited her, and the mere thought of the long hours ahead made her shoulders slump with exhaustion. At 68 years old, her body no longer carried her the way it used to, but there was no room for weakness, no time to rest. Bills never stopped coming, rent was due, and the weight of survival pressed on her frail shoulders like an anchor. She had spent nearly 4 decades in this diner, weaving between booths, balancing trays, and smiling at impatient customers. Some were kind, leaving generous tips with warm smiles. Others barely glanced at her, as if she were just part of the furniture, invisible in her own struggle. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She had to be. Retirement had never been an option. Life had stripped away every ounce of security she once had. The small apartment she called home was one missed paycheck away from slipping through her fingers, and the thought of losing what little she had left terrified her more than the aching joints and sleepless nights. The lunchtime rush had begun, and the familiar chaos of the diner filled the air. Plates clattered, coffee machines hissed, and voices rose in an impatient chorus. "Keep moving, don't mess up, just get through today." The silent mantra echoed in her mind as she grabbed a steaming cup of coffee from the counter, balancing it carefully as she hurried toward a corner booth. The moment she stepped forward, it happened. Her worn shoes found a slick patch on the tile floor. Likely spilled water no one had bothered to clean up. Her body reacted too late. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as her balance gave out, and the coffee cup slipped from her fingers. Time slowed to a crawl. She watched in horror as the cup tumbled through the air, its scorching contents spilling forward like a dark wave, straight onto the crisp, white shirt of a tall young man seated at the booth. The diner froze. The clatter of silverware halted, conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye in the room turned toward the scene unfolding in front of them. A low gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered urgently, "Do you know who that is?" Martha's heart pounded, her breath shallow. She didn't need to ask. The diner's collective reaction told her everything she needed to know. Barron Trump. A name that carried power, wealth, and influence, now stained with dripping coffee, courtesy of her trembling hands. Her knees weakened, and she stumbled back, terror gripping her chest. She had seen how the world worked. Mistakes like this didn't go unpunished, especially when they involved people like him. The diner held its breath, waiting. Would he explode in fury, demand she be fired, call for security to drag her away? Martha braced for the worst. And then Barron Trump stood up. The air inside Fred's diner thickened with tension, an almost tangible force pressing down on everyone as Barron Trump slowly rose from his seat. The pristine white of his expensive shirt was now marred by a spreading stain of dark brown, the steam still rising from the fabric. His security detail reacted instantly, moving in like a well-trained unit, their bodies forming a protective barrier around him, their hands hovering near their concealed earpieces. Martha's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The end. She had seen the way the world worked for people like her. Those who served from the shadows, expected to be unnoticed, expected to be perfect. And now, she had just ruined a powerful man's afternoon. A part of her wanted to run, to disappear into the kitchen and pretend this had never happened. But her legs refused to move. Instead, she gripped the edge of the counter, her trembling fingers digging into the cold surface as she tried to steady herself. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean—" Before she could finish, Barron raised a hand. Not in anger, not in frustration, but to stop his guards. "It's fine," he said, his voice steady and calm, cutting through the thick silence. Martha's eyes widened in disbelief. The diner remained frozen, every pair of eyes locked onto Barron, waiting for him to change his mind, to explode in the fury they all expected. Instead, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly as he patted the stain on his shirt with a napkin. "Accidents happen." The words rang in the air, so simple yet carrying an unexpected power. The security guards hesitated, clearly unsure if they should step back. Barron nodded at them, signaling them to ease their stance. Slowly, the tension broke, though the silence remained thick. Martha's legs nearly buckled under her as relief crashed into her like a tidal wave. "Sir, Please, I'll pay for the dry cleaning." Barron's smile softened. "Don't worry about it." For the first time, Martha dared to meet his gaze, expecting to see disdain, irritation, even mild amusement at her expense. But what she saw was something she hadn't expected at all: kindness. The murmurs in the diner shifted from shock to intrigue. "Is he serious?" someone whispered. "Why isn't he angry?" "This has to be a setup," another voice muttered. Martha, still gripping the counter for support, felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had spent so many years bracing for cruelty that kindness felt foreign, unreal even. Her hands shook as she reached for a rag, desperate to distract herself from the unwanted attention now pressing down on her from every direction. But before she could escape into her routine, Barron spoke again. "What's your name?" Martha froze. She had spent decades in this diner, serving people who never cared to learn her name, who barely acknowledged her existence outside of the coffee she poured and the plates she set down. And now, this man, this billionaire, was asking? She swallowed hard. "Martha," she whispered. Barron nodded. "Martha?" He tested the name on his tongue, like it actually mattered to him. Then, with a calmness that defied the tension of the moment, he said, "Do you have a moment to sit and talk?" A stunned silence fell over the diner. Martha blinked. "What?" The whispers exploded into full-fledged gossip. "Who wants to talk to her? What's going on? This is definitely a PR stunt." Martha's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to decline, to disappear before this situation grew even more absurd. But before she could refuse, she caught sight of the manager standing behind the counter, his eyes darting nervously between her and Barron. Barron, sensing the hesitation, turned to the manager and offered a small, polite nod. "I'll cover her tables," he said simply. The manager stiffened. "Mr. Trump, you don't have to." Barron raised a brow, an unspoken authority in his gaze. The manager swallowed, then nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Trump. Take all the time you need." Martha's heart pounded. She had no choice now. The room was waiting, watching, and so, with shaky hands, she untied her apron and slowly sat down across from Barron Trump, the man whose shirt she had just ruined, and who, for some reason, wanted to talk to her. She fidgeted with the fabric of her uniform, feeling wildly out of place. This was a man who sat in boardrooms, surrounded by the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world, and yet here he was, across from a tired, aging waitress in a diner that smelled like burnt toast and cheap coffee. Martha couldn't hold back her confusion. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Barron's expression didn't change. If anything, it grew softer, more thoughtful. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers laced together on the table. "Because sometimes," he said, his voice calm, "the world can be cruel. I've seen that firsthand, but I believe in showing kindness when it matters most." The words hit Martha like a wave. She felt something inside her crack, a small, fragile part of her that had long accepted that life would never be kind to her. And yet, here was kindness sitting right in front of her. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Martha sat stiffly across from Barron Trump, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to make sense of the moment. The weight of the diner's stairs bore down on her, making her want to shrink into her chair and disappear. But there was nowhere to hide, not when the most unexpected and surreal moment of her life was unfolding before her eyes. She swallowed hard, still struggling to grasp why a billionaire like Barron was giving her his time. The entire room buzzed with shock and whispers, as if the entire world had momentarily stopped to witness something that shouldn't have been happening. Martha cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I really should be working." Barron shook his head, waving off her concern. "Like I said, I've got it covered. I just want to talk." Martha hesitated, glancing at her manager again. He gave her a quick, nervous nod, as if silently telling her to just go along with it. Taking a slow, shaky breath, she forced herself to relax. Though the idea of casually sitting and chatting with Barron Trump felt about as natural as a fish walking on land. Barron leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His expression was calm, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the imposing presence the world often associated with the Trump family. "You've been working here for a long time, haven't you?" he asked. Martha blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir," she murmured, fingers still twisting the frayed edges of her apron. "Almost 30 years now." Barron's brows lifted slightly, as if genuinely impressed. "That's a long time. You must have seen a lot of people come and go." Martha let out a soft, humorless chuckle, shaking her head. "More than I can count." There was a beat of silence, just long enough for her to feel the emotions creeping up her throat. It wasn't often that someone asked about her life, really asked, without it being a polite obligation. Barron's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to be studying her, not in judgment, but in genuine curiosity. "What keeps you here?" he finally asked. Martha exhaled slowly, staring at the table for a moment before answering. "Life," she said simply. "Bills don't stop, rent keeps going up, and when you're my age, finding another job isn't exactly easy." Barron nodded thoughtfully, as if digesting her words. "That's a tough situation." Martha glanced up at him, searching for any trace of pity in his expression, but there was none, just understanding. He tapped his fingers lightly against the table, his tone casual but firm. "If you could do anything else, anything at all, what would it be?" Martha stiffened, her mind immediately rejecting the idea of even entertaining such a question. She had long stopped indulging in dreams, pushing them so far down that she had almost forgotten they ever existed. But now, with Barron Trump staring at her, waiting for an answer, she found herself reaching for something buried deep inside. "I used to want to open a cafe," she admitted, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. Barron's eyes lit up. "Really?" Martha nodded slowly, the memories creeping in despite her best efforts to keep them locked away. "My husband and I, we used to dream about it. A little place where people could come in, feel at home, fresh coffee, homemade pastries, nothing fancy, just warm." A sad smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but the moment was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the weight of reality. "But that was a long time ago," she added quickly, brushing it off. "Things didn't work out, bills piled up, he got sick, and, well, here I am." For a moment, Barron didn't speak. His expression had shifted, not to sympathy, but something deeper, something unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers lightly against the table. "So, you gave up on it?" Martha's heart twisted at the words. They weren't accusatory, just honest. She swallowed hard, looking away. "I had to." Barron was silent again, and for a brief second, she feared she had said too much, that she had somehow ruined whatever bizarre interaction this was supposed to be. But then he spoke again, his voice even softer than before. "Sometimes dreams don't die," he said. "They just wait for the right moment." The word sent a shiver down Martha's spine. She didn't know why, but something about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, the way he looked at her as if he actually meant it, made her heart ache. Before she could respond, a sudden flash from the corner of the room caught her attention. A phone camera. Martha's stomach dropped. The realization hit her like a freight train. People had been watching this entire time, and now someone was taking pictures. Barron must have noticed it too, because his expression shifted instantly. His security guards, always on high alert, exchanged glances, their postures tensing ever so slightly. Martha's face burned. I should get back to work. But before she could stand, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded napkin. He placed it in front of her, tapping it once. "If you ever decide that dream of yours is worth chasing again," he said, his voice steady, "remember that it's never too late." Martha hesitated before slowly picking up the napkin. The weight of it in her hands felt heavier than it should have been. She didn't dare open it. Not yet. Barron stood, adjusting his suit, and gave her one last nod before turning to leave. His security detail immediately fell into step behind him, effortlessly parting the growing crowd of curious onlookers as they moved toward the exit. Martha sat there long after he was gone, staring at the napkin as if it held some kind of secret. When she finally unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. Scrawled in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "Sometimes dreams just need the right moment to come true." And below it, a contact number. Martha stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Martha sat in her tiny apartment, the folded napkin from Barron Trump resting on the table in front of her like an artifact from another world. It had been 3 days since their encounter at the diner, and she had done nothing but stare at it, running her fingers over the neatly written words, tracing the ink as if they might disappear if she wasn't careful. She had memorized the number by heart, yet she hadn't dared to dial it. It felt unreal, like some kind of dream she was bound to wake up from. And maybe that was why she hesitated. Martha had spent her entire life learning not to expect miracles. People didn't just help someone like her. The world didn't work that way. A sharp knock at her door snapped her out of her thoughts. She jumped, heart racing, then cautiously moved toward it. Nobody ever visited her. Her fingers trembled as she turned the knob and opened the door just a crack. A tall man in a crisp black suit stood outside, holding a thick envelope. His expression was calm but professional, and for a moment, Martha felt the air leave her lungs. Was this a mistake? Had she done something wrong? The man, sensing her hesitation, gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Hayes?" Martha's mouth went dry. "Yes?" He extended the envelope toward her. "This is for you, from Mr. Trump." Martha's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She stared at the envelope as if it might burn her fingers if she touched it. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I think there's been a mistake. The man shook his head gently, still holding the envelope steady. "No mistake, ma'am. He wanted to make sure you got this personally." Martha's hands trembled as she reached for it, her heart pounding louder than it ever had before. The man offered her a slight smile, then stepped back. "Have a good day, Mrs. Hayes." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Martha standing in the doorway, clutching the envelope to her chest like a lifeline. She closed the door with shaking fingers, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind was racing. What had he done? What was inside? Slowly, she walked back to her small kitchen table, sat down, and took a deep, steadying breath. With careful hands, she peeled open the flap and pulled out the contents. The first thing she saw was a handwritten letter. She unfolded it, her eyes darting across the words, her breath hitching with every sentence. "Dear Martha, your story stayed with me. No one should have to give up on their dreams because life got in the way. I wanted to do something to help. Inside this envelope is a small token, a way for you to start again. Consider this not charity, but a thank you. A thank you for showing me what resilience looks like. The world needs more people like you. With kindness, Barron Trump." Martha's hands covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. She hadn't cried in years, not like this. Not the kind of tears that made her chest ache, that made her remember all the years of struggle and how desperately she had wished for just one chance. Her fingers trembled as she set the letter aside and reached back into the envelope. What she pulled out next nearly made her collapse to the floor. A check. Not just any check. One that had enough zeros to wipe away her debt. To start over. To open her cafe. Marta sucked in a sharp breath, clutching the paper so tightly she thought it might tear. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. She had spent her entire life scraping by, working herself to the bone just to keep from drowning. And now? This? Her first instinct was to refuse it. She didn't deserve this. She wasn't special. But then she thought about what Barron had said to her in the diner. Sometimes dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment. Martha looked around her tiny apartment, at the cracked countertops, at the faded photos of her late husband, at the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. For the first time in decades, something shifted inside her. For the first time in decades, she let herself think about what it would feel like to live, not just survive. She exhaled shakily, brushing the tears from her face. And then, with all the courage she had left, she reached for her phone and dialed the number on the napkin. It rang twice before she heard a familiar voice on the other end. Martha? Her breath hitched. Mr. Trump. There was a pause, then a small chuckle. Barron, he corrected gently. So, are you ready to chase that dream? Martha squeezed her eyes shut, more tears slipping free. And for the first time in 30 years, she answered without hesitation. Yes. Martha could barely believe the words had come out of her mouth. Yes. For decades, the idea of owning her own cafe had been nothing more than a distant, fading dream, locked away in the corners of her heart where old hopes went to die. And now, with Barron's unexpected generosity, that door had swung open again. But reality set in almost immediately. The money was there, but that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. Martha had never run a business. She had no experience with leases, permits, suppliers, or anything beyond the fast-paced chaos of the diner. And the whispers started almost immediately. She's just a waitress. What does she know about running a cafe? She must have manipulated him. People like her don't get handouts like that for nothing. She's too old to start something new. It's a waste. Martha tried to ignore them, but the doubts crept in anyway. Maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this. Maybe this was a mistake. She spent days paralyzed by fear, staring at blank pages of business plans, scouring through local real estate listings for a storefront she wasn't sure she could handle, feeling the weight of every single failure that had led her to this moment. And then her phone buzzed. A text from Barron. How's the planning going? Let me know if you need anything. Martha hesitated, then, in a rare moment of honesty, typed back, I don't think I can do this. The reply came almost instantly. Yes, you can. And then, a second text. Meet me tomorrow at noon. I have someone I want you to talk to. Martha wasn't sure what to expect when she showed up the next day at the address Barron had sent her. It was a quiet corner lot in a bustling part of town, a beautiful sunlit space with large windows and an inviting charm. Barron was waiting outside, dressed casually, but his usual air of confidence was the same. Marta, he greeted with a smile. Glad you made it. She shifted nervously, still unsure why he'd brought her here. What is this place? Barron gestured to the storefront. Your future cafe. Martha's breath caught. He was serious. Too serious. Panic clawed at her throat. Barron, I can't. You haven't even stepped inside yet. He opened the door, waiting for her to follow. Martha hesitated, then forced herself to step forward. The space was beautiful but empty. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, and the faint scent of fresh wood lingered in the air. The possibilities stretched before her, endless and terrifying. I already spoke with the landlord, Barron continued, watching her carefully. He's willing to work with you. You just need to finalize the lease. Martha shook her head furiously. I don't know anything about leases, about running a place like this. It's too much. That's why I called in some help. At that moment, another man stepped forward. He was in his mid-40s, with a professional but approachable demeanor. This is David Calloway, Barron introduced. He owns 3 successful restaurants in the city. He's agreed to mentor you, help you figure out the logistics. Martha stared at the man, then back at Barron. She wasn't used to people helping her. I don't know what to say. David chuckled. Start with hello. Martha let out a shaky laugh and shook his hand. Hello. And just like that, the real work began. Martha threw herself into learning everything she could. David walked her through budgets, hiring staff, sourcing ingredients, and handling the inevitable chaos of running a food business. Barron checked in frequently, offering encouragement when the weight of it all became overwhelming. But not everyone was thrilled. The skeptics were louder than ever. She's just playing rich, sneered one of her former co-workers from the diner. That cafe won't last 6 months. Even some of the locals were suspicious. She got lucky, one customer muttered. Not everyone gets a billionaire to fund their dreams. Martha tried to shut it all out. She focused on making the cafe her own, pouring her heart into the details. The warm, welcoming atmosphere, the menu filled with comfort foods that reminded her of home. The handwritten thank you notes she planned to leave with each order. But then, disaster struck. Just weeks before the grand opening, the plumbing system failed. Water flooded the back storage room, the repair costs skyrocketed, the timeline was pushed back. Martha felt herself unraveling. This is it, she whispered one night in the empty cafe. I can't do this. The doubts came crashing in like a tidal wave. She had put everything into this. And now, it was all falling apart. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Martha arrived at the cafe to find a group of volunteers waiting outside. Regular customers from the diner, strangers who had followed her story online, even people who had once doubted her. Barron was there too, sleeves rolled up. What's going on? She asked, stunned. Barron grinned. We're fixing this. Together. And they did. With a team of volunteers, they cleaned, repaired, and restored the cafe, piece by piece. Martha had never seen anything like it. People showed up for her, not because they had to, but because they believed in her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. The cafe finally opened a few weeks later. Martha stood behind the counter, hands trembling, as the first customers walked in. And then, the door opened one more time. Barron walked in, smiling. First customer, he announced. Martha let out a breathless laugh. What'll it be? Surprised me. She poured the coffee with steady hands, passing it to him with a smile. As he took a sip, a cheer erupted in the cafe. Martha felt the warmth of it all, the people, the laughter, the realization that she had done it. Her dream had come to life, and it was only the beginning. The first few weeks after the grand opening of Martha's cafe were a whirlwind. The space buzzed with life, laughter, and the smell of fresh brewed coffee. The once empty storefront had transformed into something almost magical, a place of warmth, belonging, and second chances. But as the excitement settled, the realities of running a business set in. Martha wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an owner, a manager, a leader. And every single day was a battle. At first, business was booming. People came from all over, curious about the viral story of the elderly waitress who had been given a second chance by Barron Trump. Locals dropped in, some skeptically, others genuinely supporting her. The cafe was filled with friendly faces, steaming cups of coffee, and the comforting aroma of homemade pastries. But Martha knew better than to think success would last forever. The initial curiosity brought people in, but what would keep them coming back? She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, worrying. Would she be able to pay her staff? What if the cafe wasn't enough to keep her afloat? What if, after everything, she failed? David Calloway, her mentor and business advisor, stopped by one afternoon, sensing the stress in her eyes. "You're overwhelmed," he said bluntly. Martha let out a dry chuckle, stirring a cup of coffee she hadn't even touched. "That obvious?" David gave a knowing smile. "It always is. Every business owner feels it. The pressure, the fear of failing." He leaned forward, his voice kind but firm. "But you don't have to do this alone, Martha. You have people willing to help. You just have to let them." Martha swallowed, his words settling deep within her. She had spent so many years fighting alone that accepting help still felt unnatural. But she knew he was right, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. As the cafe gained popularity, so did the rumors. The whispers that had followed her since the beginning grew louder. She's only successful because of Barron Trump's money. She didn't earn this, she was just lucky. It's all for show, she'll crash and burn soon enough. Some former co-workers from the diner refused to acknowledge her. One, Carla, had once been her friend, but now, when their paths crossed, all Martha saw in her eyes was bitterness. "You think you're better than us now?" Carla snapped one day when Martha ran into her at the grocery store. Martha's stomach twisted. "Carla, it's not like that. You got a fairy tale," Carla interrupted, her voice sharp. "Some rich guy swoops in and hands you a golden ticket, while the rest of us are still busting our backs every day." Martha opened her mouth to explain, but Carla shook her head and walked away. The words stung. She knew what people thought, that she hadn't worked for this, that she'd been given something she didn't deserve. Martha wanted to scream, to tell them how wrong they were, that she had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into this cafe, that she still worked harder than ever. But she didn't, because deep down, a part of her feared they might be right. One late evening, as Martha closed up, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Looks like you've been busy." She turned, surprised to see Barron Trump leaning against the doorway, hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face. Martha couldn't help but smile back. "More than I ever expected." He stepped inside, glancing around at the cafe. "It's incredible, Martha. You've really built something special." She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't know, Barron. Some people think I don't deserve this, that I was just lucky." Barron's expression grew serious. "Martha, do you think luck got you here?" She hesitated. "I don't know." Barron shook his head. "No, you got here because you worked for it. I didn't make this cafe successful. You did, with your passion, your effort, your heart. And if people don't see that, it's because they don't want to." Martha blinked, tears stinging her eyes. "You're stronger than you think," Barron continued, "and you're proving it every single day." His words settled something deep inside her. The doubt would always be there. The critics would always talk. But she had worked for this, and she wasn't going to let them tear her down. With a renewed sense of purpose, Martha came up with an idea. She wanted to give back, to prove that kindness spreads. She started a pay-it-forward program at the cafe. Customers could prepay for meals or coffee for someone in need, whether it was a struggling college student, a single mother, or a veteran. The idea spread like wildfire. People loved the concept. More and more, customers left extra money on the counter, telling Martha to give it to someone who needs it. One day, a young man hesitated at the counter, digging through his pockets. Martha noticed his clothes were worn, his hands rough with exhaustion. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart," she said, handing him a coffee and a sandwich. "Someone already covered this for you." The man's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I really needed this today." Martha felt warmth flood her heart. This was why she did it. Not for money, not for proving anyone wrong, but to give people a place where they felt seen, valued, worthy, and no amount of jealousy or doubt could take that away from her. But just as things were finally settling, life had one more test in store. A brutal winter storm hit the town. Heavy snowfall, freezing temperatures. Customers stopped coming. Sales plummeted. Martha felt the panic creeping back in. She had savings, but it wouldn't last forever. For the first time, she feared the cafe wouldn't survive. One night, she sat in the empty cafe, watching the snow fall outside, wondering if she had made a mistake. And then the door opened. A familiar figure stepped inside. Barron. He shook off the snow, flashing her a knowing smile. "I figured you might need some support." Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wasn't alone in this. No matter what storm came next, she'd find a way through. and she wouldn't quit now. The winter storm had raged on for weeks, casting a suffocating blanket of snow and uncertainty over the town. Businesses struggled, and Martha's cafe was no exception. The once bustling shop was now eerily quiet, the usual scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries barely lingering in the air. The Pay It Forward board, once filled with pre-paid orders for those in need, had few new contributions. Fewer customers meant fewer donations, and the painful truth settled in. Martha was running out of time. She sat alone in the dimly lit cafe, a cup of coffee turning cold between her hands. The storm had cut foot traffic nearly in half, and her savings were dwindling faster than she had anticipated. The fear she had worked so hard to silence was now a scream in her mind. She had poured everything into this dream, and now it was slipping through her fingers. Martha had always been strong, fighting battles life had thrown at her for decades. But as she looked over the mounting bills, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: helplessness. Rent was due. Suppliers needed payment. Staff members who had become like family depended on her to keep their jobs. But how could she do that if there wasn't enough money to even keep the lights on? One of her employees, Mia, a bright college student who worked at the cafe part-time, hesitated before stepping into the back room where Martha sat. "Miss Martha?" Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. Martha quickly straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, dear?" Mia shuffled her feet, looking down before she finally spoke. I wanted to say that if things get worse, you don't have to worry about my hours. I can pick up shifts somewhere else for now. I don't want to make things harder for you." Martha's heart clenched. This was why she fought so hard. For people like Mia, who had dreams of her own. For the regulars who called her cafe their second home. For everyone who had believed in her. And yet here they were, offering to leave just to ease her burden. Martha swallowed hard, reaching for Mia's hands. "No, honey," she whispered. "We're in this together." But even as she said it, a small voice in her head asked, "For how much longer?" The storm outside was relentless, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside Martha's heart. That night, as she was about to lock up, the door swung open with force, sending a gust of icy wind inside. And there he was, Barron Trump. Dressed in a thick winter coat, his hair dusted with snowflakes, he stepped inside with a knowing look. Martha blinked, startled by his sudden appearance. "Barron," she exhaled. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, glancing around at the empty cafe. The emptiness spoke volumes, and Martha could tell by the way his jaw tensed that he understood exactly what was happening. "You didn't call me," he said simply. Martha let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Why would I? I can't keep asking for help. I have to figure this out myself." Barron studied her for a long moment before he spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "Martha, you're not alone in this." The words hit her harder than she expected. For so long she had carried everything by herself. Even when Barron first stepped in to help her, she still held on to the idea that she had to do everything on her own. But as she looked into his eyes, steady, unwavering, she realized something. She had been so afraid of seeming weak, so afraid of proving the critics right, that she had been pushing away the very people who wanted to stand by her. Barron took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and walked behind the counter as if he had worked there his whole life. Martha's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" He shot her a playful smirk. "What does it look like I'm helping?" Before she could protest, the bell above the door jingled as a few more people stepped inside. Regulars. People who had noticed the cafe's struggles and came to support her. "I figured," Barron continued, pouring a fresh cup of coffee, "if you won't ask for help, then I'll just start showing up until you do." Martha stared at him, and then she laughed. A real, genuine laugh, something she hadn't done in weeks. The tension in her chest loosened, if only a little. Barron took a sip of coffee and grinned. "Not bad." Martha shook her head, placing a hand on her hip. "You're ridiculous." "And you're too stubborn," he shot back. "But that's why this place is special." By the next morning, the town was buzzing. Photos of Barron Trump working behind the counter had already made their way across social media. But more importantly, people started coming in again. Not just because of Barron's presence, but because they wanted to save something that meant so much to them. Customers showed up in droves, ordering extra coffee, leaving bigger tips, donating more to the Pay It Forward board. Even the critics, the ones who had mocked her success, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Martha had built something real, and people weren't going to let it fail. That night, as Martha counted the register, she realized something. For the first time since the storm began, they had broken even. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't from fear or exhaustion this time. They were from hope. She turned to Barron, who was sipping another cup of coffee like he had all the time in the world. "You really didn't have to do all of this," she murmured. Barron simply shrugged. "Neither did you, but you did. And look at what you created." Martha exhaled shakily, looking around at the cafe. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Martha's cafe, illuminating the newly cleaned windows and the chalkboard sign out front that read, "Fresh coffee, fresh starts." The storm had passed, but its mark remained, not in damage, but in the resilience it had built. Inside, the cafe was alive again, brighter, fuller, and thriving like never before. The scent of fresh-baked pastries mingled with the rich aroma of coffee, and the air buzzed with laughter and conversation. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had once haunted the space just days ago. Martha, standing behind the counter, wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath, watching the cafe fill up once more. The Pay It Forward board was overflowing with sticky notes, scribbled with messages of kindness and generosity. Notes that read, "For the next tired mother who needs a break, enjoy a cup on me." To the student pulling an all-nighter, "Here's a coffee to keep you going." For someone who just needs a little hope today, it's on the house. The idea had taken on a life of its own. People from neighboring towns started stopping by, not just for the coffee, but for the message that came with it. Martha's Cafe had become more than just a business. It was a movement. And it all started because of one unexpected moment. A spilled cup of coffee that turned into an unbreakable bond between strangers. The cafe door swung open, and in walked Barron Trump. His presence was still as commanding as ever, but something about his expression today was different. He wasn't just checking in. He had something planned. Martha set down the coffee cup she was holding, raising an eyebrow. "Back again?" Barron smirked, slipping off his coat. "I told you, Martha, I like the coffee here." A few customers turned, whispering excitedly. His visits were no longer a surprise, yet each time they carried a certain energy, a reminder of what had brought everyone here. But then, Barron pulled something from his coat pocket, a small velvet box. Martha's brow furrowed. "What's that?" He placed it on the counter, sliding it toward her. A gift. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, nestled on a soft cushion, was a silver pin, shaped like a coffee cup, with an engraving on the handle. "Where dreams and kindness brew." Martha's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she traced her fingers over the words. This is, she looked up at Barron, her throat tightening. "It's yours," he said softly, "to remind you of what you built, what we all built together." Martha swallowed hard, blinking away tears. This wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a home, a refuge, a place where kindness would live forever. Martha clutched the silver pin in her palm, feeling its weight, not just as a piece of metal, but as a symbol of everything she had fought for. The cafe, the long hours, the self-doubt, the struggles, it had all been worth it. She looked up at Barron, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what this means to me." Barron's gaze was steady, a small smile playing at his lips. "I think I do." A hush fell over the cafe as customers noticed the exchange. They weren't just witnessing a kind gesture. They were witnessing something far greater. The moment where a woman's lifelong dream was fully realized. A single clap broke the silence. Then another and another, until the entire cafe erupted into applause. Some cheered, others wiped tears from their eyes. Martha took a shaky breath, looking around at the people who had supported her from the very beginning. Barron leaned in and said softly, "You built this, Martha. This isn't just a cafe. It's a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, changes lives." And as Martha pinned the silver emblem to her apron, she knew he was right. Martha's journey proves that kindness, resilience, and believing in oneself can change everything. What started as an accident turned into a life-altering moment, reminding us that one act of compassion can ignite hope and transform lives. In a world often filled with cynicism, this story stands as proof that goodness still exists. If this story inspired you, let's keep the message alive. Like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can experience the power of perseverance and generosity. What's your dream? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story.